And so we arrive at the end, Chapter 8. Chapter 8 has two major purposes. The first is to really give people action steps. There's a quote in here about the idea of you don't muster the troops without giving them marching orders. That we can get people really irritated, annoyed, anxious, wanting to support. Lots of things where we can get people really excited, but unless we give them an outlet, some mechanism, some way of utilizing that excitement, that energy, that support, then it's going to dissipate over time. In fact, it's going to be more frustrating than it is helpful. So what we do in Chapter 8 is we're going to give them some specific actions to take. The other thing we do in Chapter 8 is we finish the statement, right? We finish this comment and we leave on a high note. And that the high note is going to be more or less, let's go. Let's go make great libraries. Expect more. Great things can happen. Let's break it down just a little bit. So once again, what we've seen throughout this entire Expect More comes from where we started around what makes good advocacy, and that is data and stories and action, right? So data makes stories real, stories make data matter. We need both of those together. We need both the concrete and the aspirational. But once again, we need to make it personal. We need to give someone an action, some way of being involved, some way of taking ownership of the situation you're in. So we begin with this idea of dividing between what is a great, good, and bad library. And this comes from the idea that, once again, that quote that great libraries build, good libraries build services, bad libraries build collections, great libraries build communities. I got that totally wrong, but you know the point. What we do is we begin to divide and say, look, maybe you're in a great library. In fact, we hope you're in a great library. If your library handed you this book, there's a good chance you're in a great library because they're looking to be better all the time. But what we want is we want to let them know that the way a great library stays a great library is by having their voice as advocates. The strongest advocacy for librarians and library service are those that we serve, not us. We want people to show up and say, this is how they changed my life. This is why I support them. This is why we should all support them. And that idea of telling them that they're powerful and saying it's not just enough to love us, it's not just enough to pay taxes, you got to go out there, you got to be part of it. And I give some examples of how great libraries get people involved. And I mentioned this one common mistake that fits into even great libraries, and I put it under pizza, pizza, pizza book. And I explain it here, but just really quickly, what it means is that oftentimes we feel we have to bookify anything, that if it's a great service, if it's a great program, if it's wonderful, somehow it's got to come back to a book. Somehow it's got to come back to literacy. Somehow it's got to turn into circulation. So you see story time, and we talk about story time in reading instead of focusing on the idea of this is about connecting children and their parents and the love of reading. We make sure that there are books at the end so they can take them away and check the circulation. And in story time, that's a relatively tight connection. But we also have heard about things like the library garden or this gaming tournament that I mentioned previously, where it's like, oh, but that's okay. We'll have a book in the back about games. Well, why? Wasn't the event enough? Wasn't the lending of materials? Wasn't the conversation that occurred among the people participating? Wasn't the gaming event? Wasn't the creative activity? Wasn't the 3D printing? Wasn't that enough of a learning experience on its own that somehow we have to turn it so that we put a book in there somewhere? Well, it's got to be something that can circulate. Now, it's got to be something that can circulate may come from the fact that, well, we have to have these agreed upon statistics, and this is what the board or the state library or the provost is looking for. In which case, we should do a good job of trying to change those metrics and get them more around community engagement, community impact. There's also a habit. In libraries, we have formed a habit, and that habit is a book habit. Many of us are readers. Many of us love books, and many of us started our love of libraries through books. And so it's a habit for us to always sort of as a reflex say, oh, and reading's important. Oh, and a book's interesting. I was on interviewed for a podcast, and the podcast was great. We were discussing new forms of virtual reference and how reference worked and where we could go and corporate sponsorship and just sort of all this really interesting stuff about the business of libraries and such. And in the end was, well, I would need to end the podcast on my traditional ending question, what book are you reading? And I've felt a little ashamed to say, well, frankly, right now, I'm a little too busy to pick up a book. I'm busy reading progress reports and academic journals, and I'm listening to this podcast and other things. And yet there's this sort of, well, you must be reading a book. Everyone reads a book. Well, some of us listen to books and some of us build things, and we want our communities to be learning, some through books, some through hands-on experience, some through a building, some without. So we have to give up this reflex. It's not that books are bad. They're important, amazing tools, but they're tools. Where do we want to get? We're not booksellers. We're not really in the book business. If you're in the book business, you don't put plastic bindings and stickers on them and put them on a shelf for people to eat food over. You keep them with leather bindings and try and sell them for lots of money. We're in the learning business and they're tools. So be careful of this pizza book problem. When you're putting on a program, does it serve an aspiration of the community? Does it involve community? Does it have an impact? That's the answer you want, not, and by the way, how does that translate into circulation statistics? If that's what the world you're in, you need to spend some time with the people who support your library and say, can we come up with some better metrics here? So be careful of the pizza book. So then we have to deal with the idea that some people are going to read this because they are dealing with bad libraries. And the first thing I want to say is this has nothing to do with their collection. In fact, the full quote about great libraries build communities, bad libraries build collections. Good libraries build services. And by the way, the full quote was, of which a collection is one. Great libraries build communities. Collections are important, but they're not insufficient. The idea that you can have the most amazing collection of materials, but if no one is allowed in the room, it's not going to have a great impact. We've seen this in special collections, for example, archives, and the idea of these beautiful, amazing materials, old books, manuscripts, etc., that a good archivist, a good special librarian looks at those materials, special collection librarian, looks at those materials and realizes that they have a dual mission, but they're two sides of the same coin. One is preservation and the other is access. We preserve, we repair, we conserve documents, materials, and such so that people can access them to use them in scholarship, in learning, in inspiration, and what have you. We need to look at our collections the same way. They're important and they're great tools. No one has really invented a more powerful tool around mass information since the book. And it was an invention, and it was an invention that took centuries. And people can say, well, what about the computer? And I can say, well, what about places without power? And what about places where people don't understand basic technology skills and such, or the network, etc.? Sometimes books work just as well, and sometimes even better, less distraction, etc. So they're powerful tools, and we should look at them. But the collection isn't where you define a good library and a bad library. It's in engagement. And so this whole section on the action plan for bad libraries is just a way of hammering again and again and again that the collection is not what we're using as a metric. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's an insufficient thing. It's how we use our tools, including our people, our scholars, our community, our technology, all of these things around our great impact advocacy mission. Then we have to do, frankly, the same thing around the building. Because the same thing is, there aren't enough people. Quick, build a greater building and people will show up. Well, there's a story here about how that's not necessarily true, and we know it's not true. We've seen, for example, the entrepreneurship community pick up in some of the most unexpected old warehouse spaces where it's actually a benefit if it's not too polished and too nice and they can paint on the walls and write on the floors and such. We have to be aware that it's, once again, the environment matters but is insufficient. A brand new building is guaranteed to increase traffic for about a week. After people come in and the curious stop showing up, if they don't find something there that's useful to their lives, they won't come back. So once again, this isn't about building buildings. This isn't about buying more stuff. So then the question becomes, so what do we do with a perceived bad library? Where do we go? And I begin with this little quote about test everything and retain what's good. We have to be aware as librarians that people need to ask us questions. Why do we have reference? Why do we have books? Why do we have collections? Why do we have buildings? To us, they may be so fundamental, how dare you even ask the question, but in truth, everyone should ask the question. The whole institution is about having people ask questions, so why not about us? We can't be defensive about it. But let's give people some specifics. So let's give our community, once again, something specific to do. The first is the idea of educating themselves. They start with this book, but where else can they go? How else can they find out what's going on? Where are other services doing? How can they go learn about what are considered excellent libraries and services? I'm a huge proponent of learning through play, having people play, having people fiddle. And you may say, well, that's great for makerspaces and 3D technologies, but what about libraries? Well, I've been in libraries where what they've done is they found an old warehouse space or some unused space within the library, and they have pop-up libraries where they try different configurations, different services, different service models, and they play with them. And so having board members, provosts, principals, teachers, community members come in and play. What are they doing? What's neat? What worked? What didn't? Let's try new spaces. Let's get out and actually begin drawing spaces and build models and Legos and clay and etc. and see what we think. Get people active and engaged and involved. Because great libraries come from great librarians, so we hit that one again, which is playing, but librarians should be there to also play and should be there to include and facilitate playing by the community. So we, as librarians, have to be ready to get down, get dirty, and try these things. Benchmark. Once again, we don't want to let folks off by saying, I love my library, it's a great library, without any form of metrics to say, well, prove it. How do we put that into a report? And there's some suggestions. For example, if one of the things that we do oftentimes is we put out things like circulation data. And if we meet with a board or a provost in a monthly meeting format, it's horrible data because we know it varies from month to month. We know it varies from season to season. We know in public libraries, for example, usage actually goes up in certain months and down in other months. In school libraries, we know that there are times of the year, testing, where the library might as well or sometimes is closed. So be aware of how we use those data. Year-over-year data is better. Scalar metrics, where you compare them to, you've seen a lot of them. If you haven't, go on the net and find them, where they talk about infographics like more people went to the Boston Public Library than went to all professional sports in Boston combined. More people went to the Brooklyn Public Library than visit the Louvre in France, etc. Those comparison metrics have a lot more impact. They tell a better story than simply saying, we did 300,000 this year. We did 399,000 last year, and we're hoping to get to 301,000. Well, fill in the metric. Fill in what? Books, circulated, people in, what have you. But even those numbers are abstract. Build the narrative into the metrics that you use. Trust expertise. Trust your librarians. Once again, it's important. But be questionable. Be inquisitive. Ask them. Challenge them. Think beyond just what you're told. Visit. Maybe it's next door, maybe it's next county, maybe it's next school, maybe it's next state, maybe it's next country. But getting out there virtually in a real way is vital and important. Go find out what works. Go visit and see it and ask the question and look at the environment and have conversations. Create forums or fora, depending on what your preference is for the grammar here. But that idea of bring people in and have discussions about where do you want to go, ask questions. That's what we're trying to do with this text, with this course, with these materials, is seed some of those questions, but be out there, connect, have that discussion, have advisory groups. Map conversations. See what your community is talking about. What is the big topic? Is it the new highway and which way it goes? Is it the new undergraduate curriculum? Is it the new testing schema? Is it the new use of mathematics? Is it the new medical scheme? Is it the new director? Is it the new whatever? Have a conversation. What is the community talking about? Not what is the community talking about the library, nor is it what are people in the library talking about. It is what is our community talking about. Then figure out how can the library assist, be part of, facilitate that conversation. Start with what the community is talking about, then find your place in it. I mean, the question, if you ever ask, how can the library get better? It's a horrible question. People don't know. And frankly, even if they give you an answer, they're making it up. And almost always what we know from study after study is if you ask someone, how could a library be better? They can only answer from what they know. They can't look beyond what's there. It's not their job to figure out how to make a better library. It's yours. It's their job to be involved and be part of it. And yes, they have ownership in it, but their central motivation is often not that institution. Yours is. Invite them in and push. And what's the action plan for good libraries? Well, this is the summation, right? This is the end where we give them a rah-rah that says, look, you probably have a lot of good libraries out there and you want them to be great. The only way that's going to happen is if you're involved, if you're there, if you feel ownership in it. And that's the note that we end them on. We begin them with the discussion about, look, libraries have changed the world. And we end with, and it's your obligation to make sure your library is ready to handle it. We start in Alexandrian uprisings, and we end up with, is your community prepared to aspire and move forward, and is your library there to help? That's the arc we've brought them through. We've brought them through libraries are important. What are they? Where are they? They're not what you think. They're more like books. Oh, they're really a platform. That platform has expertise, and that expertise is in impact and learning. And is your library doing it? And here are some ways you can bring it about. So that brings us through the chapters. I thank you for your attention.